Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Silesia, starting from the 9th, 10th century. We could even start from the 6th, the first Slavic migrations in the area. But let's say, the Central European regions, of course, have a limited documentation. Uh, the first kind of properly Silesian character given by the sources is through the Bavarian geographer around the mid 9th century and Thietmar's Chronicle, that in between the 10th and the 11th century, that indicate the area which would become known as Silesia. The etymology is uncertain, some connected to the Silingi Germans back in the day, because those were areas that were originally Celtic, Germanic, the Slavs arriving later during the migration era, or Mount Schlesa, that was an important center also of worship, in fact, in Celtic times, etc. In these Lenzens, properly, the Schlesianie, lived this land near, in fact, the modern Wrocław, and along, in fact, the Lez, that's a river near the aforementioned Mount Schlesa. And by that point, there are these demographic estimates that put them in several tens of thousands people. And they would increase over time. At the turn of the 10th of the 11th century, they seem to count up to 250,000. The numbers are uncertain, but it's important to stress how Silesia here was an important chunk of this Western Slavic areas, which would confer essentially that political and cultural unity in high medieval times, and making of the Duchy of Silesia, well, in fact, the most important within the Polish kingdom. These tribes were of Lechtic origin, in fact, connected to the Czech Slovak subgroup fundamentally, and also the closest ancestors of ethnic Poles in the area. According to the Bavarian geographer, they were divided in 15 civitates, so essentially it would be districts in the Slavic administration, in the Latin terminology, and they counted altogether this, in fact, these subgroups revolving eventually around what would become proper cities in the area: the Apollini, close to the modern Opole, the Dadodesani, the Jadojanie, close to the modern Głogów, the Golenizici, dwelling near modern Racibórz, Cieszyn, and Opava, the Lupigla, living on the Giručice plateau, near, in fact, Giručice, the Trebuane, in the proximity of Legnica, the Poborane, close to the course of the Bób river, the Psovians, close to Pskov, etc., that lived, in fact, around these hill forts, right, in mountainous, forested areas, in these wild lands. They were also quite warlike, given the general instability, and also the growth, as we will see now, of powerful neighbors for the times and places that would make these Slavs also traditionally in their military culture fanatic defenders and unruly subjects, let's put it in this way. And in fact, this is kind of the character that Silesia would take on over time, like properly a frontier area that was contended by the more powerful neighbors. In fact, in the 9th century, part of the Silesian territory came under the influence of Great Moravia, that was, in terms of political influence, quite extended, and came probably to exact some tribes on the area. And that is kind of the first historically attested kind of state, we can say, in the region. But Great Moravia's rise and fall was quite quick, and it's rather its successor in Bohemia that gradually expanded in the Silesian area, just across the Sudeten. And at the beginning of the 10th century, in fact, the Duke of Bohemia, Vratislaus I of the Przemysl dynasty that would rule, in fact, up to the end, the 13th, beginning of the 14th century in Bohemia, subdued the Golensitze and soon also advanced towards Middle Silesia, occupying part of it. Now, Wrocław was possibly founded, as we understand from the etymology, after Bratislaus himself. Bratislaus' son Boleslaus I instead subdued the Boborane between 950 and 965, and later also the Opolane and the Dosice. And the town of Boleslawiec bears his name instead. So this was an important form of political and territorial affirmation. Wars waged in a kind of repressive fashion, but also with some important colonization and at least garrisoning of the most important centers. And Bohemia at that point was also under, as you know, Germanic influence already, and Christian. And so it kind of opened to the evangelization of the same Silesia, as well as international trade and the broader political advantages deriving from the new, essentially Frankish influence that had kind of westernized the same Bohemia. In 973, we have also Abraham ben Jacob, this famous Hispano-Arabic Sephardic Jewish traveler, crossing the land and not talking anything specifically about it, but still documenting the importance of Silesia, essentially at the crossroads of the major continental European highways of the time. Would have intensified in the Middle Ages. Is to say the Royal Road, roughly from Russia to Portugal, and the Imperial one, right, from say crossing the Central Europe and reaching Rome. And as you know, the Silesia would be an important minerary center, especially in the High Middle Ages, where at least some better mining technologies were brought on the fore. Also, the German colonization, as we will see, brought this kind of know-how, etc. But it was an important land that, properly in its frontier location, was quite important. At this point, the Bohemian expansion towards, across the Sudeten shows, of course, this phase in which Bohemia at some point had ambitions, even in Poland, that, however, later on would compact as a greater power and kind of even try instead to, in fact, and manage even with the German alliance to bring the Bohemians on. And in fact, this is what happened, had already happened actually in general since the end of the 9th century, because the Holy, what would have become at least the Holy Roman Empire and Poland were already forming, and at least extensionally were more important than Bohemia, that however had important political cohesion that could just against this neighboring land assert some control. And there was an attempt from the side of Otto I to extend political control on Silesia through the donation of the tithe of the Działdowice area to the Diocese of Meissen, and also in 996, by the way, Otto III would define the Oder River up to the spring as the border of the Margravate of Meissen, talking about Saxony. And this was just kind of an attempt, of course, also to assert an ecclesiastical control on the land from the side of the Saxon archbishopric. but it would fail on the long run, also with the decline of the Ottonians, because the Polish state, that time led by Mieszko the First, conquered Silesia instead. Right, so there was a concerted effort by a certain degree, also in the missionary activity, but the land came under the control of Poland. So much that, in fact, the Jagodzice area had already been brought kind of under Polish sphere of influence in 970. And at this point, Poland and Bohemia were warring, and Mieszko annexed Middle Silesia and its main township, Niemcha, with the help of the same Holy Roman Empire, which at that time was against Bohemia, talking about the 90s of the 10th century. So this brought under Mieszko's successor, Boleslav the First, to the establishment of an independent Polish ecclesiastical province in the year 1000. That was essentially the bishopric of Wrocław at the Congress of Gniezno. That, in fact, was also the seat of the archbishopric under which Wrocław was under. And after the death of Boleslav I in 1025, his oldest son, Mieszko II, was crowned King of Poland, which was becoming effectively, a unitary domain, in spite of eventually the further Piast fragmentation to its various branches. And in fact, these efforts were bringing to gradual results. There were also some setbacks, including the invasion from the side of the Kievan Rus in 1031, when Mieszko himself was sent into exile. This triggered a pagan coming back in Silesia through a revolt in 1031-1032. These people were, again, essentially resisting against the occupation of a neighboring but still foreign, and in that moment Christian power that had broader connections, kind of escaping it centrifugally, and so that entailed also rejecting the new ecclesiastic, the new religious policy that entailed properly a greater control on the land. If anything, that was the main issue. At this point, the Silesian diocese of Wrocław was even threatened in its existence, given that the bishop was ousted. But as we were saying before, things went often back and forth. In fact, Mieszko himself regained power in the same 1032 and managed to restore order in the area. He died 2 years later, followed by his son Casimir, known as the Restorer, kind of a meaningful name. And in 1037, however, yet another revolt took place from the side of the nobility, and Casimir fled again. At this point, the Bohemians intervened again as Duke Bretislaus I invaded Greater Poland, pillaged it, and took control of Silesia in 1038. Casimir came back to Poland the year after, started to reunite the country once again. So you understand here what was the general degree of stability of these powers. They would seize as whichever opportunity was at hand at the moment, because it was very difficult to centralize, right, with any surplus, with any permanent political, institutional, administrative structures, right. And Casimir managed by the mid-11th century to retain control of most of Silesia, once again, albeit being forced in the process to pay a tribute to Bohemia that was always looming across the mountains. And this was 300 marks, eventually raised to 500, and the two countries would have a lot of quarrels and and wars because of Silesia, the control on land. A land that, as you understand, was also fractured within itself politically, because one side was kind of pro-Polish, the other pro-Bohemian, depending on the interests of the local nobility. And let's say the general antipathy was more towards Poland, because it was, at that point, the more powerful and the kind of the closer power, right? Just Bohemia at least was across the mountains. And in 1093, the Silesian nobility, in fact, backed by the Bohemians, revolted yet again. And at that point, they asked specifically for the removal of the Palatine Szczecek, that was this, despotic administrator placed by the Poles. And in the process, they backed the recognition of Prince Zbigniew of Poland to the rise to the Polish crown. And the revolt was partly successful. The same Zbigniew was officially recognized as heir to the Polish throne. However, in the process, the despised Szczecek maintained his rule over Silesia until 1099. Also, he fled 2 years after from the country. This phase of instability terminated with the peace treaty of Gladsko, when essentially the frontier between Bohemia and Polish Silesia was defined, kind of historically was stabilized. In 1138, the St. Pauls would this would be important for claiming the rights on the same Silesia later on, but Bohemians in the late Middle Ages kind of took over the land again as properly possession of the Polish crown, right? Even aside the branches that had controlled it through the splitting of the Piasts in different, in fact, sub-dynasties, kind of. Albeit the kind of the Bohemian influence on the area of Gladsko itself was confirmed in a way. In 1146, the High Duke Władysław II of Silesia, Duke of Poland and of Silesia, was exiled to Germany by his brothers, who essentially were opposing him in his pursuit to rise to the High Duchy over the remaining dukes of Poland. This was the practice similar to what existed. We made a video recently about this in the Kievan Rus, where it was a preeminence of a main duchy over the others, and it floated dramatically. At that point, the new High Duke became Boleslav IV, known as the Curly, and Silesia was a possession of his at this point. So as we will see, Silesia would grow in importance, actually, within properly the Polish state, as essentially one of the lands that made up normally the possessions of the most powerful of the Piasts, right? And part of the reason being, of course, that this was kind of a land closer to the west. Properly the German colonization had happened, had started already under the Silesian dukes for increasing the wealth of the land, that managed to expand at some point also further north, etc. So it was an important area, also kind of relatively close to Krakow, that was at some point would make an entire unity together with the Silesian province under the High Duke. And so fundamentally the most developed area of Poland at the time. And Władysław in Germany tried to persuade the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III and Frederick Barbarossa to support him in the endeavor of retaking his duchy, but he didn't meet with a lot of success. In 1163, his three sons, Conrad, Mieszko, and Boleslav, however, took possession of Silesia with imperial backing, and they probably shared the rule of the land until 1172, before dividing the territories. Conrad was actually prepared for a clerical career, as he had studied in Fulda in Germany, and so that was quite of a prestigious curriculum. Boleslav administered Silesia until Conrad's early death, when in fact Boleslav incorporated also what had been up to that point Conrad's domain into his duchy, and so restoring some unity to the land. At the same time, Mieszko, that had still his own kind of lordly prerogatives, expanded his own duchy with parts of the Duchy of Krakow around the towns of Bytom and Oświęcim, which were given to him by Casimir II, and that was that had become ruler over the Polish Seniorate province at Krakow, right, and thereby High Duke of Poland, and also over Opole, which instead he had received after Boleslav's death. And Boleslav's son, Henry I, decided, together with Mieszko, to rule out the right of succession among their branches. So this would actually contribute to the separation of the historical regions, historical provinces of Upper and Lower Silesia, roughly like the northwestern, southeastern side. And in the same year, the Kingdom of Poland abolished the Seniorate altogether, and Silesia's duchies thus became kind of an independent state under a constitutional law that contemplated the idea that Poland was essentially made up of all these various, independent but still kind of interrelated branches. So this was a moment of great expansion. In the first half of the 13th century, the Silesian Duke Henry I, the Bearded, nicknamed, reunited himself much of the Kingdom of Poland, in spite of this pre-existing division, by summing, in fact, the rule of the various chunks, and expanded his dominions as far as the Duchy of Pomerania, that historically speaking was something probably on its own, that later would be also brought under the Teutonic rule, etc., but had historically resisted also Polish expansionism. And at least Henry managed to retain for a while some of its southern areas. So these were the achievements of the time. At this point, the Polish monarchy, as we've seen, was struggling, right? The same loss of kind of a rejection in practice of any centralizing prerogative from the side of the king is kind of the proof of the impossibility of a more unitary domain, and so also the lesser chunks kind of lost something in terms of individual power. But again, the situation was fluid, so there was room also for these broader power shares, and Henry became also the Duke of Krakow in Little Poland at that point, so in 1232. And this provided him with the seniorate of Poland altogether, also encompassing most of Greater Poland 2 years later. But there was in fact a failure to achieve the Polish crown by the side of Henry, who was succeeded by his son, Henry II, the Pious, famous for his power as Silesian Duke and for, in fact, Lord over other areas of Poland, but also and especially for his tragic death in 1241 at the Battle of Legnica during the Mongol invasion of Poland, and the first one. And the event was disruptive for the country altogether, even though Silesia was not entirely ravaged, but the whole system was significantly crippled by the Mongols' devastations. And Henry II's successors couldn't manage to retain their control outside of Silesia, which were lost to other branches of the Piasts. And this before the Mongol invasion, the importance of the Silesian dukes, especially Henry I and Henry II, was seen as a sort of monarchy within an otherwise divided kingdom of Poland, right? And it was also a moment of magnificence, of further westernization, of the consolidation of true feudalism on the model, especially of the German lands. And in fact, aside from the German colonization per se, these were just the areas of Poland that were kind of more similar to Germany, mostly influenced the Frankish culture, etc. And as we were saying before, the Mongol invasion was really rough for the land. Silesia was in part spared. However, there were some important military events, such as, for example, the Mongol siege of the castle of Wroclaw, that was supposedly defended successfully by a miraculous fireball sent by blessed Czeslaw, that kind of is remembered most for that feat. And of course the disastrous Battle of Legnica that took place at Legnickie Pole, near the town, in fact, that saw the literal massacre of the Polish-German army against the Mongol horde. And as you know, these were essentially the westernmost limits of the Mongol invasion that raided around. Also, yes, they reached the same Germany, the same Italy, but upon the death of Ögedei Khan, kind of what was aborted fundamentally. It would have been aborted anyway for that moment of the year, but fundamentally they all came back to Central Asia for electing the new Grand Khan anyway, and so things changed considerably. And these are also the centuries of the German settlement for which kind of Silesia is famous, given the, like Bohemia and our Central European areas, this kind of face-changing nature of these lands in ethnic terms, with a massive injection of a German element. And we say Germans, so they came from different areas, mostly from Middle Germany, but there were also Walloons, for example, who were some of the first Germanics to settle in Silesia. This started consistently from the mid-late 12th century. They were weavers, so stimulating the local industry. This especially in Wrocław and Owawa, but were also naturally mostly peasants near the same Wrocław, Owawa, and Namiślów, and also monks, importantly enough, such as in Sobotka. And this German colonization was incentivized by the Piasts to increase their essentially manpower and agricultural output and trade and tertiary activity. And this thing was regulated initially through, in fact, the pre-existing Slavic administration, but literally the nature of these lands began to change face also under that point of view, as we will see. Administration was boosted also by the same resources brought on by commerce and crafts to become ever better organized. There were, by the mid-12th century, something around 20 castellanies across Silesia that were the main local districts that corresponded to important market centers, castles, albeit some markets were not accompanied by castles, such as in the case of Shroda, Shlaska, and Sobotka. And of course, this witnessing the autonomy of these centers and the profit that still they brought to the land as a broader trade circuit. And in fact, in Silesia there are 8 markets counted properly from an administrative point of view, which means that we're naturally much more scattered across the land, but evidently some of these acquiring some rights for which they were considered even as the center of some broader district. And church organization at this point benefited from this growth as well, as castellanies with fortified churches emerged importantly at this time, albeit the order, let's say, of for example, of the church's network with all the villages, the single parishes were still somewhat disorderly and developed on the original, the initial kind of spontaneous growth of this spiritual centers that would be reorganized later on during the same Middle Ages. And the dominions had also a sort of fortification, which was aided sometimes by natural obstacles, also properly engineered, like woodland, that were known Preseka, Hag in German, Indago in Latin. And the peasants were to keep these borders fit, even including the one between Upper and Lower Silesia was made up like that, and it was an important way to organize the political and territorial control of the land. And we don't know exactly when the German settlement began, but we can assume that already from the entourage of Boleslav I, that, as we've seen, had been exiled in Germany, in Thuringia specifically. Some monks came, in fact, from abroad, mostly Cistercian ones from the Saxon Abbey of Pforta, and were brought into Silesia by the Duke to establish the Lubież Abbey. The Cistercians, as you know, were famous for, like, experts in land exploitation, also in horse breeders for the Crusades, etc. The Silesians, as the Polish nobility, did participate to the Baltic ones. So there was a broader network of properly including know-how, zootechnic capacities, new agricultural systems, etc. that entered Silesia through the monks. And the Cistercian monasteries also received the permission to settle other people in their possessions, and were mostly Germans, as they came from the same lands where these monks had left. And this was accompanied also with the recognition of probably an exclusive right to use their own German law in such communities, and so not being subjected to the Polish one. And this brought, in some areas, especially in Lower Silesia, in the longer run, to probably the substitution of the older Slavic and Polish laws with the German one. Towns as political communities even were properly chartered with the codified German town law, right, known at the time either as the Magdeburg law or some local Silesian variants, such as the Schroeder Schlasska, that is the Neumarkt law, in Latin the Jus Teutonicum Srodense, so from Silesia Jus Teutonicum Novi Forense, so from a new market. And these were variants of the Halle law, that, as you know, these were German towns that had developed kind of their own system, and juridical system was exported in those lands that were colonized by, if not by the same people of the town, but let's say that were imitating this town's regulations because they were somewhat successful. This occurred importantly also before the devastations brought by the Mongols in Poland, right? Examples are the same: Wrocław, Owawa, Sobotka, and Schroeder Schlasska. And the Ostsiedlung accelerated at the beginning of the 13th century under the rule of the Silesian Henrys, who were particularly interested in their own western border security. So by bringing in more Germans, at that point were kind of more distant, still there was a considerable space between still Silesia and some of the closest Germanic areas, but this gap was narrowed by the settlement properly of these communities to maintain also kind of a military control on the area, especially on the one called the Przeka, from which, however, German settlement also overflowed and began to colonize for example, the Sudety Mountains, and pretty much everywhere at that point, especially in the area comprehended between Wrocław, Legnica, and Żobkowice Śląskie. And naturally there was, as we were saying before, also a kind of more important interest that had to do with the developments that in Western Europe were pioneered in the field of mining, mineral extraction, and Silesia being rich in precious metals, and this brought the dukes to settle German miners in what would become, in fact, the towns of Goldberg, today's Wotoria, that in fact maintains the gold etymology there, in 1211, and Löwenberg, Lwówek Śląski, in 1217. These were some of the earliest, in fact, German towns in Silesia, by the way, so you understand the priority attributed to the minery centers, obviously enough. And interestingly, these towns were so kind of new, and in fact they had a typical plan, architecture, central square known as the ring, which was known in Polish as Rinek, and many modern Polish words, in fact, are just a Slavization of German ones that were imported from the West, especially connected to these new types of, in fact, sometimes it could be political, military, right? The military vocabulary of Poland is heavily influenced in medieval times by the German one. We will have to talk about this as well. We made some video about the Polish medieval warfare, exactly in high medieval times. And it the areas of Upper Silesia were less Germanized, right? They would maintain historically also essentially a Slavic prevalence. From the south, there was instead greater pressure, also because there were, the Germans were settling many other areas around, such as Moravia. It was just bordering Silesia and kind of overflowing in the area. And the settlement continued even in spite of the Mongol invasion, etc., because, as we've seen, first of all, the Mongol damages were limited to a narrow strip from Opole to Wrocław and Lemnica, but also because properly this demographic expansion and colonization was connected to very often much worse, say, much more negative reasons, let's put it this way, than the progressistic ones that we've thought. Like, literally, these people needed new land, new opportunities, whatever. And the land significantly expanded as a consequence also in population, as you can imagine, and its organization. For example, the Weichbild constitution replaced the old Slavic Castellani constitution in some of the most Germanized regions. Every village began to build its own church. By the 13th century, I think that were by the end of the century there were something like 1,200. The parish network became more dense and better organized, so much that the diocese of Silesia was split into archdiaconries in Breslau, Glogau, Opole, and Linitz. These are the German names that in fact were given to these towns, eventually replacing the Slavic one, coexisting with it. And we don't know exactly how many people precisely lived in Silesia at the time. In the 14th century, some say something between, in fact, half and 1 million by 1400, right? And more than 1 million by 1500. So in spite of all, there was an important expansion. In spite of the crisis, the decline of Silesia as a political entity, as we will see now. Upper Silesia was 80% Polish, accounts for 240,000 people, and an equally split population of 60,000 among Czechs and Germans. But Lower Silesia had basically the equal number of Poles and Germans altogether, something like 375,000. And for the rest, there were also many German settlements that were Polonized, right? During the migration, they came to live in places where they spoke mostly Polish, where they were the minority. Others, as we've seen, instead retained for up to the 20th century fundamentally their own German identity. And in Lower Silesia especially, the Germans came to dominate the towns, whereas the Poles maintained the rural areas. And basically the ethnic geography, we can call it, of this land would remain largely unaltered for a very long time, up to the 18th, 19th century. So, as we've seen, the role of the Silesian Henrys as properly monarchs of Poland by certain standards was in reality the last moment of greatness of Silesia in terms of political autonomy and power, right? There were some attempts by the Henry's successors, such as Henrik IV, Probus of Silesia, that was Henry II's grandson, to attempt to gain the Polish crown, but they failed, right? Either because they died before the political situation was adverse, and Duke Przemysl II of Greater Poland united two of the original Polish provinces and was crowned in 1295, but was murdered in 1296. And according to his will, Greater Poland was to be inherited by Duke Henryk III Głogowski, that was the Silesian Duke of Głogów, who in turn was naturally aspiring to unite Poland, and at some point even claimed the title of Duke of Poland, so stressing properly the military control, the military hegemony on the country. However, even at that point, the Silesian dukes were, say, opposed to other candidates from the Kuvayan line of the PS. That was Duke Vladislav I the Elbow High, and Henrik didn't make it to kingship. At this point, the area was sensibly weakened for King Wenceslaus II of Bohemia to decide to extend his rule in the area. This was possible also because he had been crowned as King of Poland in 1300. So this is the phase in late medieval history when Central Europe dynasts tended to strengthen their own power by essentially marrying to each other with these dynastic ties, very often also with the extinction of certain lines. The same Przemyslids were to die out at that point. In the attempt, in fact, of securing more power locally by this concentration of power deriving from a supranational domain. But this also didn't mean that wars by the same national, in fact, dynasts were over. In fact, for half a century, a war broke out between Vladislav and later his son Casimir the Great of Poland, and a coalition of Bohemians, Brandenburgers, and Teutonic knights at that point were trying to essentially to break Poland apart. And at this point, the Silesian dukes sided with Poland, importantly enough. They accepted Vladislav's claims for, by the way, also for sovereignty over other piasts. So this was moment of mental hostility when the sides understood that it was important to confer more power to a central ruler, even if this could have meant kind of a threat for their own autonomy, because the ones coming from the outside were even more dangerous. And the popes consented also for Vladislav's coronation, and at that point, for 2 times, before the coronation and after the coronation, 1319 and 1320 respectively, the at least 9 dukes of Silesia declared that their possessions laid inside the borders of the Polish kingdom. So stressing that no foreign government was acceptable in the 9 dukes of Silesia, by the way. So these were the entirety of the Silesian dukes, and this is important unity that, as we will see, would fundamentally be lost later on. There were also some territorial changes due to purchase. For example, the Bohemian king John of Luxembourg at this point, that has substituted Przemyslids, sold the area of Prudnik to Duke Boleslav the Elder. So Silesia actually acquired another chunk. It was essentially Bohemian historical. However, Silesia was to lose its own independence factor, because as we've seen, even though the Polish crown had claimed properly a control per se, like as a greater authority, independently from probably the individuals that would wear it. The control on all these lands, fundamentally, that were Polish by 1138. In spite of this, various states had declared kind of their own independence within, however, the same crown hegemony, right? So this sounds strange, but it's really not. It basically meant that if you really wanted to govern Poland, you had to have individually collected a certain amount of dominions that, however, per se remained separated, right? So these were the problems, essentially the core problem of Central European monarchies, that they didn't make it to centralized like the Western ones. And this brought, however, to both the wall and the and also the smaller chunks kind of lesser power. In fact, the last independent Silesian Piast was Bolko II of Świdnica, who died in 1368. His wife Agnieszka ruled the Świdnica Duchy until her death in 1392. And after that, the Duchy of Silesia became a vassal of the Bohemian crown. This historically, right? Also later and during the Habsburg domination, modern age, and so on. And so literally, Silesia at this point shifted from Poland to Bohemia, became a part of the latter. And that's where actually the Poles stressed that every land that had belonged to their crown in 1138 was to be recovered from whichever power had at this point controlled it. And the decay of Silesia in this sense was gradual in part because the various lands were inherited separately by the Bohemian crown. Opole in 1314, Świdnica in 1368, Oleshnica and Głogów in 1476, then others in the modern age. So how did Silesia fall into Bohemian hands? Well, we've seen that there was a papal consent for the coronation of the Polish king Vladislav and the control essentially on the duchy altogether. But the successors of Wenceslaus III, Przemysl, that as we've seen had owned both the Bohemian and Polish crown, thought otherwise, and for this reason in 1327 the heirs of the Bohemian crown, at that time the Luxembourgs in the west of John, invaded literally Silesia. And in fact, in the following 2 years, most of the Silesian dukes essentially passed to the Bohemian side in a way or another. In 1331, the Duchy of Głogów and in 1336, the Duchy of Münsterberg were properly annexed to the Bohemian possessions fully. And there was an intervention of King Charles I of Hungary that, leaving Polonia Minor, enforced his supremacy over the Upper Silesian Piasts too. In 1329, Vladislav the Elbow High, mentioned before, also fought with the Teutonic Order, that in turn was supported by John of Bohemia, that had invaded Poland, dominating Mazovia and the same Lower Silesia. So you understand how, just by sphere of influence, we're talking about that Poland was struggling against the Bohemian neighbors, the Teutonic neighbors, and the Luxembourgs essentially benefited from this situation by occupying, especially Lower Silesia. It was also more Germanized, and the Luxembourgs also were kind of favoring the German element in their establishment, and this kind of broader westernization also of Bohemia. In 1335, however, Saint John of Luxembourg renounced his claims in favor of Casimir the Great of Poland, that in turn agreed to renounce his claims to Silesia in turn. So formalized in the Treaty of Trenčín and Congress of Visegrad in 1335, ratified in 1339. And after another Polish-Bohemian War, confirmed in 1348 in the Treaty of Namslau. This was the moment in which the Polish kingdom formally renounced, can forever, quote literally, for all future times, marking officially from a political territorial point of view that border between the Holy Roman Empire and hence the Germanosphere in Silesia and Poland, and the Slavic lands that, as we were saying before, lasted for centuries. And initially, the Bohemian domination was better than the Polish one, because that was the heyday of the House of Luxembourg. Prague was the heart of Europe at the time, both culturally, economically. So Silesia came to be the province of effectively the most robust and developed state in Europe at the time. It was a contingency in many ways, and things went down, especially after the rule of Charles IV of Bohemia. That was, in fact, the most important ruler in in the time, arguably in the entire 14th century, and that brought, as you know, to that rather quick decadence through the Hussite wars later on that literally destroyed the country. Like literally, Bohemia lost 1/3 of its population. Was a disastrous event, properly for the stability of the land, the public authority, and Silesia, as we will see now, would suffer accordingly. Right, but initially it had received important influences from, for example, the University of Prague. The Polish connection did remain. Right, Krakow was still near. The same Leipzig, as a German influence, remained. So Silesia was always, especially at that point, blessed by kind of the best of Bohemian, Polish, and German cultural influence. But as we were saying before, after Charles IV's death in 1378, things began to go downhill pretty fast. As first of all, Bohemia's protection over Silesia ended. So properly the capacity of Bohemian crown to maintain an authority on the land evaporated. This was a pretty bad time in Europe altogether. It was the very much discussed on this channel crisis of the mid 14th century. There were mercenaries robbing, the famous robber barons devastating the country everywhere. There was an important demographic and economical drop, both because of plague, of war, and so on. And there was some attempt by the local Silesian princes to issue, for example, Landfrieden, like this pacification of the land, but the situation wouldn't change. And actually, the worst, in fact, was yet to come with the Hussite wars, were as brief, as intense, demolished the situation for good, fundamentally. And but the role of Silesia here is interesting because they kind of stood from the side of authority of the Catholics, of the emperor. In fact, as you know, after 1419, there is the death of King Wenceslaus of Bohemia. The Czechs refused to accept Sigismund as their new heir, and this because they deemed him responsible for the death of Jan Hus at the Council of Constance and so on. So all the instances of the Hussites, etc. As a consequence, Sigismund actually issued a Reichstag in Wrocław. So by choosing essentially Silesia as the center of such, among his Bohemian lands, properly the center of his rule. In fact, this was the first Reichstag issued east of the Elbe River ever. And it dealt with, of course, the Czech problem, how to put down the revolt in Bohemia. And interestingly enough, 18 Silesian aristocrats rendered homage to Sigismund and promised military help. And in 1421, a Silesian army repeatedly invaded northeastern Bohemia, however, being defeated by the Hussites in the process. At this point, also Moravia joined the Hussite movement, and this isolated Silesia and Lusatia in the further north within the Bohemian possessions at that point, and directed towards these mostly, in fact, Catholic areas the hatred of especially of the radical Taborites, say in English. In January 1425, the Hussites passed on the offensive, pressuring the Silesian lands through such delightful journeys known as the Beautiful Rides, that essentially were an equivalent of the chevauchée of the 100 Years' War in the land. And Silesia was ravaged and devastated in the process. There were Silesians actually supporting the Hussites. I mean, a few, a minority altogether. There were even some Polish lords, such as Sigismund Korybut, and the same Silesian Duke Bolko V, in fact, nicknamed the Hussite, who helped the heretics in the process, destroying more than 30 towns and sacking and robbing the country. And in spite some of the Silesian dukes and wealthy towns such as Breslau and others managed to actually plunder back some Hussite Bohemian Silesian borderland, especially the areas around Nachod and Trutnov. Some Silesian centers like Gliwice, Kluczbork, Niemcha, and Obtmuchov became bases for the Hussite raids in Silesia as well as in the nearby regions throughout all the war until 1434, when the radicals were essentially defeated by the more moderate Utraquists at the Battle of Lipan in Bohemia. So at that point, Sigismund actually came back to Bohemia and united again Silesia, except the lands of the aforementioned Silesian Duke, the Hussite Silesian Duke Bolko V, and issued a Landfried, appointing Bishop Konrad, Duke of Oels, as senior governor, the Oberlandeshauptmann of Silesia. But problems were not over, because after Sigismund's death in 1437, the Bohemian crown was disputed between Albert II of Augsburg and Vladislav III of Poland. And as a consequence, Silesia was in between the two countries, became a battleground once again. And as you understand, this doesn't quite help to stabilize the situation. The majority of Silesian princes supported Albrecht's widow, Elizabeth, and after Vladislaus died, too, in 1444, Bohemia interim regent, George of Podebrady, was elected king, and enfeoffed his two sons with the Silesian duchies of Münsterberg, that is Ziebice and Opava Troppau, right? And also Bohemian territory, such as Glatz, which became historically closer to Silesia. Also, he appointed Czech peers as governors of Silesian hereditary principalities, and thus made Czech the official language of large parts of Silesia, which naturally was an affirmation of Bohemia fundamentally over the Silesians, after all the damage that the area had suffered, and Bohemian crown being the more effective power to enforce on authority there. As a consequence, the Silesians backed in part Matthias Corvinus, that was the enemy a bit of George Podebrady, who was king of Hungary, former son-in-law of George himself, and thus rival king of Bohemia. And at this point too, however, Silesia and Moravia suffered the burden of the war. Again, the war went on for a long time, until it started in 1469, even after George of Podebrady's death in 1471. It was continued by his underage successor Vladislaus, and there were many battles. It was exhausting, and the outcome was that both the monarchs kept the title fundamentally, while Vladislaus received Bohemia, Matthias took Moravia, Lusatia, and Silesia. So this brought to a further decay of Silesia, as you understand, that had become quite an unsafe place, an unstable one. Parts of Silesia were acquired by other powers. For example, just to remain in medieval times, Siewierz was acquired by the Bishop of Krakow in 1443. Other lands such as Oświęcim in 1457 and Zator in 1494 were sold to the kings of Poland. These were mostly lost to Poland, and they would be fully integrated within the Polish kingdom, sometimes also very late, but still gravitating around that orbit. And you understand that, as we've seen, Silesia was not a small country. I mean, for Central European standards, like more than 1 million inhabitants, and considering its resources, etc., was still an important land to seize, but it was disrupted from a political, social point of view. So never underestimate that. You can have a very rich place that is ravaged by a war and still remaining kind of rich, but if you don't have a political cohesion, it gets eaten by the others. Naturally, the first cause was mostly the Hussite War and these other dynastic struggles concerning the Bohemian crown. Some markets decayed. Here, some market rights were not even renewed, and so some cities also lost their importance. Also, the international situation kind of shifted the direction of Silesian market, kind of rather for the worse. For example, the loss of the Genoese colonies to the Turks in the Black Sea brought part of that east-west traffic in continental Europe to decay, and since especially the Hungarian kings exercised a control now on Silesia, it was mostly the Hungarian market that the land revolved around. There were, however, some improvements. For example, the consolidation of German trade in the process that brought to even some further kind of consolidation of the political prerogatives of these communities in a ever more crystallizing order, hierarchy. And this was naturally engineered from the top in a fashion that tended naturally to fix part of the problems. This would succeed mostly in the 16th century, but already starting from the 15th, you see that Matthias Corvinus' reforms were successful to kind of compact the country after the phase of political fragmentation. I mean, the same Sigismund early on had tried that. But there were always royal representatives in Silesia. The Oberlandeshauptleute, the senior governors, were, this kind of advocates were watchful over the situation. They ran justice, etc. And there was also at that point a division between upper and lower Silesia in the process, so that the country was kind of also not considered as a just as a wall, right? It was necessary in part, but this could allow the local justice to work kind of better for those realities that were separating, as we've seen also probably with different ethnic character and so on. And there was the Fürstentage, that is the princely diet that began at some point to be ever more regular, right, yearly in nature. And this too was kind of split, at least sometimes, between Upper and Lower Silesia. Naturally, the first aim of the Landtag was the one of collecting taxes, right? So troops deployment, coinage, these kind of things, and there was also a supreme princely court, known in Czech like Kniežecí Soud, in German Fürstenrecht, that was established for the first time in 1498. And on that occasion, to settle the disputes between Vladislaus II of Bohemia and Hungary, the princes and barons, the free lords, and the estates of three duchies that were at that point the most relevant, that is Glogov, Glogau, and Opole, Raciborz, and Żagań. Then eventually Silesia would pass at the death of Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia in 1526 to Ferdinand I of Austria, that was elected King of Bohemia, and thus ruling all its crown possession, including Silesia. And other things that mostly pertain, in fact, to modern history. But you understand how Silesia fundamentally follows the pattern of many other larger and smaller Central European dominions. There is this initial compaction in high medieval times, even with some important exploit, right? Like under the one of the two Henrys, or some transforming the land in some important polity, but framed within still an unstable royal institution that was pushing for the decentralization, privatization of power. Essentially, especially from the standpoint of a single duchy, the exposure to more powerful enemies, such as Bohemia, rather that managed, in fact, incorporated. And this important collapse, especially by the second half of the 14th century, the beginning of the 15th, due to the broader 14th century crisis and this other, in this case, of the Hussite Wars, but this greater instability is still deriving from the broader failure of the Central European monarchies to centralize, and therefore to provide, especially with the mid-14th century crisis, of a solid public authority that would disrupt, in fact, what had been built otherwise in a still kind of orderly way in the High Middle Ages. Because yes, these were, as we've seen, lands were undergoing a further privatization, but at the beginning of High Medieval times, they had the advantage of having not been feudalized so heavily like Western Europe. But paradoxically, they lacked exactly that, because the feudal glue, let's say, was so strong at some point. It doesn't matter how intricate it was initially, it consolidated into something that would give rise to kind of more compact states. I mean, we've seen it even with Bavaria the other day, right? You know, how the land would start at some point being even important. We've seen the same times of the Wittelsbachs and the Luxembourgs here, even with Silesia. But eventually would fragment, just because there was not a previous solid public institution like in high medieval times other Western lands had built. In fact, if you compare this to the French lands, to the French fiefs, I mean, even a land like Burgundy, like Champagne, but even Normandy or Brittany, that were kind of weaker, but they had a probably a more robust establishment that also was framed within a robust monarchy. In the Central European areas, you don't find that. You find a constant mess that in part produced also an important, which is in fact Mytalo-European culture in many ways, that is based on this plurality, like the outcome of this, that is a plurality, as we've seen, even of ethnicities, of communities, of different laws, etc., that the sovereigns couldn't really handle with iron fist, because they didn't have enough power, so they had to be quite careful and to counterbalance these various influences. That did produce a civilization, but still from a more problematic standpoint, let's say, than in other areas. So Silesian history is definitely quite interesting, and we will keep talking about it. However, today we stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.